All right, hello and welcome to the Benzo Rehab Dungeon. This is Religious Deconstruction, episode 15, where we no longer really talk about religion, but we just discuss concepts in general. It is the 4th of July, 2022, in these God-blessed American United States. I have with me today. Would you like to go by an alias, or is your first name okay?
Yeah, first name's good. First name's good.
All right, I'm joined by Robert. Do you want to throw out your Instagram handle or no?
No,
Okay.
they don't need to see that garbage.
I think it's a good enough Instagram. Joined by Robert, a friend of the dungeon, who is a little bit of a dork when it comes to the Supreme Court. And the
Back in the day, I used to play Fantasy Supreme Court. It was a tough look.
That's pretty rough, man. I'm not gonna lie.
It's a tough look.
Our topic today is we're starting off with the lack of any kind of functional legislative branch, right? The legislature doesn't do anything really. The best it can do is get into like a gridlock on very simple things that should be passed, but politics one way or another kind of don't let anybody do anything useful. The filibuster, not letting a simple majority decide what happens in the legislation, that sort of thing. And so a lot of decisions that should be made by the legislature, codifying things into law through legislation, are actually falling to the Supreme Court in terms of, deciding yay or nay on court cases. So that's our starting point. Robert, if you would like to say a couple of words on that or give some kind of historical context on that.
Well, yeah. So I mean, I think if you want to understand why the Supreme Court has sort of been given the power that it has, and why you often hear people sort of shrug their shoulders when the Supreme Court makes a decision, it's like, there's nothing we can do. You got to go back to the Warren Court, right? The Warren Court presided over by Earl Warren. I think he took over in 1953. He stayed for like 15 years, but there's a long time where there was this sort of liberal Supreme Court theory, and the thought is like, okay, getting rid of racial segregation is unpopular. Getting rid of prayer in schools is unpopular. Having the police not beat the shit out of black people is unpopular. So what we're going to do is we're going to have these unelected officials who aren't accountable to anyone and who get approved very easily onto the court. We're going to let them take over and do the things, right? So you get some really influential Supreme Court cases like Brown v. Board, which allegedly ends segregation, or at least tried to, or at least ended some segregation in the law. You get Miranda, which says the police have to warn you before they try and beat the shit out of you. You get Gideon v. Wainwright, which says just because you're really poor, we'll give you an overworked attorney who can pretend to give you justice. But you get these sort of nominal gains, right? And because the Supreme Court was sort of doing the dirty work that legislators didn't want to, so they didn't have to stand up to segregationists. They could just say, oh, look, we've got a court. They're making the choices. Sorry, guys. There was a general thought that the Supreme Court was good and its undemocratic leanings could work towards our benefit. And the thing that was going to keep it in check was the fact that the people on the Supreme Court were elites, right? These are people who went to like Harvard and Yale and really no other law school. So the thought is, okay, they'll be very smart, they'll be very capable, and they're not going to upset the balance of things, right? They're not going to lean too hard against the rich people because they're rich themselves, but also they're not going to do anything crazy because they want to keep the status quo. So we'll get like this slow expansion of rights, right? You get Griswold, you get Roe, things are going great. But that theory has not held up. And now that people have really cemented the fact that the Supreme Court just makes decisions and there's nothing we can do about it, it's very hard to push against it. Almost every single really bad Supreme Court decision that was made this term, and let's be clear, there were a lot of really bad decisions made. This is the worst year since 1857 and probably since 1803 on the Supreme Court.
You got to go back pretty far to find a worse.
Yeah, you got to go back to either like Dred Scott, right, or Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court decided it could do things. Like that's the level of bad we're at. Most of the bad rulings could be reversed by Congress passing a simple law,
Sure.
right? Like you look at this disastrous EPA ruling, could be undone by Congress passing a law, probably. You look at Roe, could be undone by Congress passing a law. You look at the gun control thing, probably couldn't be undone with a law, but Congress can make it a lot better, right? But because we've accepted that you've just got these 9 unelected people who do their thing, yeah, sorry, there's nothing we can do, guys, except send out fundraising emails.
Yeah, which I mean, that's a whole subject in of itself.
I think we'll get there.
Probably. So yeah, I mean, it's really long history, and I think what you're saying is ringing true to what I understand. They're doing the dirty work of legislators who don't kind of stuff. Maybe it's on. I mean, that's the entire reason that Roe has never been modified. First off, I think a lot of cats don't want legal abortion. So they've kind of kicked the can down the road, letting something like the court handle that. And the you know the public perception has always been, well, the Supreme Court ruled in favor. I get that wrong. Favor of Roe, or
It was in favor of Jane. It was in favor of Jane Roe.
Okay, all right. So they rule in favor of Roe. And I think a lot of the public doesn't even understand that and so they just kind of like take that as the. Then a couple of other rights kind of get affirmed by the court. And there's that I'm. So you get same-sex marriage is kind of affirmed in this way. Rights to the privacy bedrooms get affirmed.
Yeah, the Lawrence was the case that said that sodomy punishment is unconstitutional. Many people don't realize that was from like 2003.
Yeah,
like these are not long-standing things.
Yeah, which is insane. And so I think there's been this large public the court is like a necessary evil securing our rights, and that what we've already achieved, they can't really go back on it. And it's good that that's not really the case in some ways, because lots of passed down. Good that
the one that always gets brought out for this is Plessy v Ferguson, which was the 1896 ruling that said separate but equal is totally okay, guys. This won't cause any problems. Don't worry, they'll definitely be equal.
Right. Yeah. And that obviously doesn't pan out very well. They reversed that one.
Yeah, that's Brown v. Board reversed it.
Brown v. Board reversed it, right? And yeah, so it's good that they can reverse these rulings. It's also bad that we rely on them. Basically, what right court case?
Yeah, and like let's not forget, right? Like I know you're not doing this, but many people tell a picture where like the Supreme Court doing like really bad stuff is somehow contrary to the same times they're expanding rights. like as you said, Lawrence v. Texas, which said sodomy was bad, is 2003. Texas v. Johnson, which said you can't arrest people for burning a flag, was 1989. Between that was Bush v. Gore, where the Supreme Court just decided an election.
Right, which is, I mean, it's insane, and it's pretty insane that, you know, the Democratic Party didn't back against.
Yeah, I mean, they were okay with who wrote that opinion. I'm pretty sure it was Rehnquist, but they were okay with the Supreme Court writing opinion saying the government not counting your vote is not a big deal and doesn't count as an irreparable harm. Which is like, yeah, I mean, the main argument was, yeah, if we recount, there's going to be a cloud over Bush's legitimacy, guys, and that'd be really bad for Bush, wouldn't it? I'm Scalia. Like,
Which, you know, rest in peace, King. Yeah, no, I mean, the power of the courts has expanded so much, and I mean, it's always had like an outsized power to begin with, but you know, really in like the last couple of decades, it spiraled out of. Typically, you know, the Supreme Court previous uh kind of used to reinforce whatever the government kind of a situation. Oh, hey, there might be some kind of legal challenge to a government, goes to the Supreme Court and says, "Hey, you're my lawyer. Could you take a look at this? How they're wrong." The Supreme Court has not typically been that not very antagonistic government.
no, like why would they be? Most of the people who end up on this court, I mean, by necessity, right? They're deeply indebted to the kinds of government officials they've got to rule against, just because like the president has to nominate them and the Senate has to say yes. But like you'll see, most of them have backgrounds as like federal prosecutors or people who worked in the DOJ or attorneys general. Like,
Yeah.
it's basically impossible. Oh, it used to be basically impossible to get on the Supreme Court unless you had spent significant time working in government. Now you just like have to teach law and say abortion bad. But
Yeah, I mean, Amy Coney Barrett out in this. I don't remember where she went to law school, but I remember it.
I'm pretty sure she graduated from Notre Dame in addition to teaching there.
Okay.
But yeah, then on like the flip side, like you've also got Elena Kagan, who was basically just like the dean of Harvard Law School and then a solicitor general for half a year. Like it's, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, like Amy Coney Barrett, like never really had any compared to serving on.
Yeah, she was on the seventh court for I think 3 years.
Yeah, which
So like not nothing, but certainly like less than someone like a Brett Kavanaugh.
Yeah, so
who's got his own problems.
Yeah, of course. We're not standing Brett Kavanaugh. In fact, I don't think we're standing any Supreme Court.
You're not standing Brett Kavanaugh. Have you not? Like, come on. He likes beer. You like beer. Come
That's
on.
true. Yeah, I actually don't drink beer very much anymore. Yeah, no. So we've got frat boy Brett Kavanaugh. Let's maybe talk about, you know, like what the composition of the Supreme Court is right now. We've got the Chief Justice.
Yeah, we can just go through them a little bit. Like, so John Roberts is, I mean, I think the best way to tell like what Roberts is about, because he's the Chief Justice. It used to be his court. It's no longer his court. But, like, you look at what he did on Dobbs, which was the abortion case recently, right? You had the 5 conservatives saying we're going to completely get rid of Roe. You had the 3 liberals saying, what the fuck are you doing? Don't do that. And then you had Roberts, who wrote a concurrence that basically said we should get rid of Roe, but more slowly, because we need to preserve our legitimacy and not make change too quickly.
Right.
Like Roberts is as much of an asshole as the rest of them, right? But like his big thing is slow change. He's like your very typical conservative, don't shake things up, just oppress people slightly more slowly kind of guy. He got his start as the attorney general for Reagan. Well, actually got to start clerking for Rehnquist. Like he's been around a while, and then he became the Chief Justice under George W. Bush.
Yeah, so obviously a guy who people call him more of a centrist, pretty decent.
He's a centrist only because he wants the Supreme Court to stay as the institution it is. Right, like another case you can look at is like NFIB v. Sebelius, which was the Obamacare case, where he sort of just made up the thought that the Obamacare fine was actually a tax. Yeah. It's like, no, they say it's a fine, they say they're penalizing you, but really it's just a tax, guys, right. And they can tax people. Right, like it's. And he made that up just because he needed some reason to save Obamacare so the Supreme Court didn't look biased. Like, yeah, it's calling him a centrist, I think, undermines the ways in which, like, what he really wants is to keep the Supreme Court as powerful as possible.
Yeah, and he doesn't seem too interested. I mean, doesn't seem too interested in, like, what the court actually stream or rapid, like you're saying, you know, change is slow and the doing anything reactionary.
Yeah, and he's willing to step out to be reactionary on the cases that he knows people won't pay attention to, right? So like Shelby County, where they basically said like, yeah, we can get rid of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 because racism doesn't exist anymore. Like he wrote that opinion, right? He was all on board for that. Like Black people won't ever have their votes taken away by Republican states. It's unconstitutional to make sure they're not oppressing people. Like, yeah, it's Roberts doesn't give a shit about anything except his own image.
But you know, I think bringing up that Roberts integral and how like down on that racism doesn't exist anymore in this country because we have a Black president. Something that any one of your incredibly uneducated. I hate to like shit on these people too much, but these opinions are not like extremely nuanced or anything like that. Like Scalia, in my opinion. So you know, we don't have a court that's like these incredibly wizened people that have really profound thought. We've got a court that have very similar uneducated race. So that's go ahead.
Speaking of uneducated racist uncle, Clarence Thomas, huh?
Yeah, that's another one we could talk about. I
mean, as long as we're going through it, we might as well go through by seniority. Number 2, CT, Clarence Thomas.
Is he the second most? I thought Alito was.
No, Alito was W. Bush, and Thomas was original Bush.
Okay. So about an 8-10 year gap.
15. It was actually a while.
I don't even know.
No, no. I mean, it was the very beginning of Bush 1 and near the end of Bush 2.
Okay, gotcha. So yeah, let's dig into Clarence Thomas a little bit. You know, you've already kind of made the Uncle Tom joke.
Well, I did notably I did not make that. Clarence Thomas is certainly racist, but
yeah,
I don't. You don't need to bring in any like race traitor language to make it happen. What you need to bring in is that really like his start was working for Reagan because Black culture was causing lots of problems, and Reagan had the solution to racism. Like that was how Clarence Thomas got in.
Yeah, he's part of that conservative older black generation that reinforces all these negative stereotypes about poor black people. Uh, does like the Bill Cosby thing of like, oh, you gotta pull up your pants and get to work, young whippersnapper sort of stuff. You know, there's problems in the community that absent, relying too much on welfare, sort of. It really buys into the Reagan era, fair queen, and
And
just
of course, like he replaced Thurgood Marshall, which like if you want to find somebody who was like a good Supreme Court justice and a good lawyer working for good, like he's about the best case you can come up with.
Yeah.
And like then we're replacing with Clarence Thomas because Clarence Thomas is also black.
Right.
Like that's it.
Which I mean that's part of like the shell game that gets played with somebody like Amy Coney Barrett, right? Where the ID politics of who replaces Bader Ginsburg. Don't worry, we're gonna put a woman, and obviously that's missing several. No huge fan of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Not as shitty as I guess. Very very mixed bag of opinions. But I mean, replacing someone who at least a little good Barrett, who just happens also has really weird ties to first off the Federalist Society, which is all these old sort of ties, um, the quiverful kind of comes from clearly like just being a woman saying Ruth. Yeah, so back to Clarence Thomas, Thurgood Marshall leaves. Did he retire or did he die?
I'm pretty sure he retired. He was very old at the time he
Yeah, he
retired,
was
but I
very
think he just
old.
couldn't handle the work anymore.
Right, so I think he did retire. Gets replaced by Clarence Thomas, who's an obvious ant. Yeah, we found another black guy to fill. Doesn't matter that
And
he
he
completely disagrees with everything Thurgood Marshall.
also doesn't matter with all the credible sexual assault stuff.
Yeah,
Just
right.
like
Maybe let's go into that a little bit and how he ends up appointed, regardless of.
yeah, so like the thing about Clarence Thomas was the first of like the really controversial Supreme Court justices because before Thomas you would regularly see like 95-0 votes and maybe one or two vote against it just to like make a point, but everyone knew that justice was getting confirmed. But Thomas made it through 52-48 with like some Republicans rejecting it and but not all Democrats rejecting it. Joe Biden, he shows up here, he ran Thomas's hearing and did just a terrible job with everything. Literally no one thinks he did a good job, but the TLDR is like Anita Hill, who's someone Thomas worked with, felt like she was sexually harassed by him. He regularly like made sexually offensive remarks to her, comparing himself to a porn star. He like talked about he found some hair on a can of Coke and said it was her pubic hair. Like he talked about how anyone who pointed this out about him was lynching him, literally hanging him from a tree. And this was just worse. Actually, it was worse than lynching because it was destroying his reputation and not just his life. Other people filed complaints against him, but chose not to testify because they felt intimidated and like their lives and careers would be ruined if they said anything. Which, in the case of Anita Hill, just turned out to be true. Like that.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, that's proven by Anita Hill, who essentially had to live in like exile, a decade or
yeah.
at Harvard.
Yeah, to be clear, I'm not saying they did anything wrong. I'm just like, that's why there wasn't more against him.
Yeah.
Like
No,
they wrote
right.
letters saying, we'd love to testify, but, and then Joe Biden, of course,
No,
didn't
no, no. Yeah,
reduce
I'm
anything.
just,
And
I'm just
it's,
giving that additional context.
yeah. And then a couple years ago, an investigative journalist, I think their name was Corey Robin, like went deep in on this. Robin is like a Thomas scholar who writes a lot about conservatism and negatively. And they found that it was basically like there was no way he didn't do it.
Right.
Which we didn't need a journalist to tell us, but people like to say these days that like Anita Hill was discredited or that it was all a lie, or look, Thomas and Kavanaugh both had hysterical women go after him because women are really bad.
Yeah, and I mean, if you watch either testimony incredibly well.
Yeah, and then the male future Supreme Court justices absolutely fucking lose it.
Yeah, I mean, how many crying baby Kavanaugh memes have we seen like in the last couple of years? Absolute red in the face, tears coming down his cheeks. I didn't do anything wrong. I like beer. Don't you like beer, Senator?
Yeah, so that's how Thomas gets on the court, and then on the court, Thomas is basically. I'm not going to make comments on Thomas's intelligence because I just have no idea whether he's smart or not. But he's clearly like he's more batshit than the outcome of a salmonella outbreak at the vampire convention. Like it's bad. I mean, really, like Scalia looked at this guy and said, "We agree on a lot of things, but this guy is absolutely insane. His jurisprudence is awful."
I think Thomas isn't necessarily dumb.
Well, yeah, and Thomas's style, yeah, sorry. Yeah, Thomas's style on the court, yeah, it plays into this, right? He basically never asks questions, so people can't get counter arguments against what he's saying. And then he'll write solo dissents where he lays out some insane legal theory, not because he thinks it's actually going to have impact on the court, because he knows in the Federalist Society, which is basically like this group of conservative, it's a conservative legal group that basically anyone who wants to make progress in a Republican administration has to join in law school. They worship Thomas, and all his dissents get read there. So he's influencing future generations to agree that, like, for instance, the 14th Amendment doesn't actually protect any of your rights. Yeah, like, this is just a straightforward Clarence Thomas view. And people have said it for years, but now it seems like it might actually go somewhere.
Right. And you know, the reason that he kind of laying all this legal groundwork isn't going to be able to his lifetime. Basically leaving a trail of dissents that future Supreme Court justice as part of their opinion. I mean, dissents get used all the time, and previous dissents, no matter which way the court get time and current dissent. So he's kind of just like laying this theoretical groundwork generation to lean on. And look, the history of the Supreme Court, there was a couple of justices, and so we actually agree with their that. What do you think is kind of happening with?
Yeah, absolutely. You can see this in the current generation of like Trump appointed federal justices, as people will, especially in their dissents, they'll just cite Thomas and say, yeah, anything Thomas said is right. And then eventually, you know, you get enough Republicans and you get enough court nominees. Eventually, even if they're not people who totally agree with Thomas, people who are at least willing to enact what he wants on similar measures end up getting power. Just to give you, I think this is a good example of how absolutely like nonsense Thomas's legal theory is. So there was this case when he was a federal judge. The state of Louisiana, like, they had mental institutions back in those days. They still have them now, but like institutionalization was much more widespread. And there was this legal question of somebody has a mental illness when they're institutionalized, then they get better. Do they have to be released? And the court said, of course you have to release them, right? You're violating their due process rights by keeping them contained, even though there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. Thomas dissents and says, no, states have a lot of power. I think as a policy matter, it might be good to remove sane people from mental institutions. But federal judges just shouldn't be imposing their policy preferences. If states want to keep people in insane asylums, even though there's nothing wrong with them, yeah, why not? Okay, I'm going to like any basic reading of the due process clause of the 14th Amendment suggests that that's obviously wrong. But Thomas just applies this across the board. It's the exact same states' rights arguments you heard in like the 1850s about how even though the Constitution says everyone's free, yeah, these people can be slaves. States have a right to do whatever they want. It's nonsense.
The concept of states' rights seems to come up a lot when it comes to people's ability to be. So that's probably enough background on Clarence Thomas.
One more thing that I just think is amusing. Do you know what Clarence Thomas said about cross burning in Virginia?
I actually don't know this one.
This is the one good thing Clarence Thomas has done, and the one time it can be like kind of helpful. Just to show Clarence Thomas deep down knows better. Is Virginia had a statute that said you can't burn crosses in front of people's houses. And of course, the Supreme Court overturned that because cross burning isn't inherently intimidation, right? It's protected speech, and you have to show that they want to send a threat. This is like the one good thing Clarence Thomas ever did is he dissented from that and said, like, no, this is insane.
Yeah.
you can't burn crosses in front of people's houses and terrorize them and say, oh yeah, First Amendment. Like, this will be a recurring thread as we go through these conservative Supreme Court justices, but like they know better deep down, most of them, except for this next guy, Sam Alito, who I think is just a small-minded asshole.
Yeah, he seems like he really sucks.
Sam Alito is just angry that other people get to have a good time in this world. Right. So he just consistently acts against them. But yeah, Sam Alito, he was appointed by George W. Bush. He took over Sandra Day O'Connor's spot. Honestly, there's not a lot to say about Alito, except in any given case, just imagine what like the most evil, most harmful thing to do is, not just like an opinion, right? But think of the worst way you could do it. That is the Sam Alito way.
Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty clear that wasn't he against? He was against same-sex.
Yeah, so this is where Sam Alito gets revealed to be an asshole. And just to be clear, John Roberts is the Chief Justice. This will be called the John Roberts Court, but Sam Alito is in charge now. He gets to decide what happens. In 2015, Sam Alito writes a thing saying this history and traditions test he loves doesn't cover same-sex marriage. Right, naturally so. A test that says what we need to do is look back at what's traditionally been allowed in the United States. That's what the Constitution protects. Obviously, same-sex marriage has not been protected in the United States for very long, or there wouldn't be a court case about it. Then in 2022, he writes an opinion saying this history and traditions test doesn't defend abortion, but don't worry, it totally defends same-sex marriage. Don't worry, don't be mad at me. I'm committed to defending same-sex marriage.
Yeah, and there's no way he's not lying about that, right?
Honestly, I'm a little surprised he wrote it at all. Because that's the only evidence that he's not lying, is that I thought he would have been enough of an asshole to just say this needs to get gotten rid of, like Clarence Thomas did. The only conservative on the court committed to defending same-sex marriage is Brett Kavanaugh.
Which
it's not even clear that's right. Yeah. But he wrote a concurrence saying no guys, same-sex marriage actually really does pass the constitutional test.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Alito hates same-sex marriage. He wants gender discrimination. He wants sex discrimination. He wants no COVID-19 pandemic rules. He's on record saying they're basically all unconstitutional.
Right.
It's
Yeah, I have trouble believing that because I think Alito is capable to everyone's and I think
that's his status quo.
so. I think even though he wrote it caveat to this, no, don't worry, it doesn't affect same sex. I think that's him kind of just throwing people off because Clarence Thomas has made it clear that all these other rights are on the chopping block. Come up to the and the lie that he's basically just really concerned about their legal precedent. Clarence Thomas is kind of arguing is, look, I'm not saying I'm necessarily against this. I'm worried about the legal precedent, how we that's obviously not, who knows what will happen if these come up to the and they need to.
Yeah.
So I think
And
Alito,
all Alito really said, even all he really said was just, we're not overturning them right now, and the reasoning
right.
from this case can't be directly used by lower courts to overturn these things, which really means like he made no guarantees
Well,
whatsoever that
and
they
in
were
a
going
way
to
that's
protect
kind
it.
of like a wink and a nudge to the lower courts. Say, hey, look, if you're a conservative judge and you're trying to get this law changed, uh, you need to tweak your legal you kick it up to those.
Yeah, it's not a, I think it's less of a wink and a nudge to lower courts because that's just going to get appealed anyway. It's a wink and a nudge to state legislatures to
Sure,
basically say,
sure,
look,
sure, sure.
take the risk, ban same-sex marriage. I've got your back.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, because this is how it works, right? Is state legislatures pass laws that don't pass current constitutional muster. Lower courts say, what the heck? You can't do that. We're going to overturn this. Then it gets appealed up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme
Right.
Court says, yeah, we've changed our mind now. Like that's how court cases get overturned.
Right. Yeah.
Because just because something is unconstitutional doesn't mean states can't pass a law and enforce it. It just means that eventually, 5 years in the future, someone is going to tell them no. So to like all your friends that are saying, oh, don't worry, Alito said that probably interstate travel bans for abortions are unconstitutional, so states totally won't pass laws on that. Yeah, yeah, good luck with that argument.
Well, and then it also needs to be pointed out that the Supreme Court has the emergency docket, or otherwise known as the shadow docket. If they feel like a case is urgent and requires an immediate, they don't even need to give an opinion on how they rule. Sometimes they don't. They can just give a ruling, quick thumbs up, thumbs down, sort of state like Texas, basically extraditing people back to Texas. So it's not
Yeah, so
even
there.
like a 5 year out thing in some cases. I think because when a state like Texas or Alabama or other states that are really cracking down hard on reproductive rights, they start trying to drag people back from Colorado or I think Oklahoma. No, Oklahoma just signed. I can't remember which. But the
Missouri went hard on one. There have been so many, it's hard to
yeah,
keep
yeah,
track
yeah.
of.
So there's a lot of so when these states start trying to track down people who have left the state to get an abortion, even if they're still out of state, and try to drag them back to state to be tried and prosecuted, I think that's going to have a strong case for um even if they rule against that kind of behavior. I think the decision is going to come a lot quicker, just because the urgency of the matter of happening.
The expansion of the shadow docket in recent years is one of the most alarming developments on the Supreme
it's
Court.
crazy.
Like, just to give a little history, because I think many people don't realize how new this is. Like, ordinarily, the shadow docket is used to just like give people more time to file a brief or to say we're going to have another round of oral arguments. The only times it's really ever historically before 2017 been used for like substantive things is when, like, the two times I can think of is like the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The Supreme Court said, stop, don't do that, right? Which obviously you need like an emergency procedure because once they're dead, there's nothing you can do.
Right.
And stopping the bombing of Cambodia, which again is like, we have to stop this today because if we don't, people will die and really bad things will happen. Compare this to like since 2017, Donald Trump basically had an in on the Supreme Court. And we're talking like things got brought on the shadow docket, like whether transgender people could openly serve in the military. Certainly like a significant issue, but not immediate life and death this year. Whether you could use the military to make a border wall. What kinds of asylum restrictions you could have. Like the Supreme Court granted 28 in the year 2017. Over the past four presidencies, well, I guess past four presidential terms, it was like 16 years, 3 were granted. Right? So like it's been an enormous expansion. And it used to be you pretty much only got the shadow docket for cases that were 9-0, right? Where like everyone agreed. So the need to give a reason is less pressing. But now you're getting it for things where there's only a few people who agree. You got like 5 or 6. And the Supreme Court doesn't have to say who agreed on it, why they made the decision they did. And like they don't have to give reasons for it. So lower courts can't do anything with it.
Yeah, that does. Yeah, and I brought it up on the last regular podcast episode. One of the last times that the shadow docket was recently roll back a bunch of state and tribal rights protection. Basically like a soft rollback of like it was doing stop pollution of like water sources for tribes and thing. So yeah, the shadow.
Well, that's
docket,
really important.
What's that?
Right, because that's really really urgent because corporations might lose some money if you don't do that, right? Yeah. So like right away we've gotta. It used to be like only when you're gonna bomb a country does the Supreme Court intervene emergency, but now it's just like I might lose some water rights and be out a couple $1 million. It's like now that's when the Supreme Court acts.
They're not letting me dump my slag into the river that people get their water from. And that's really hurting my bottom line. let me call in the Supreme Court. So we
can go through the rest of these people pretty quick.
Yeah, they're less influential.
Yeah. You've got Sonia Sotomayor, liberal.
You mean liberal in the most insulting way?
So Sotomayor is slightly less insulting. Kagan is a liberal in the worst way possible. Okay. Sotomayor, like she will. There are a decent number of 8-1s where Sotomayor like tries to stand up for justice.
Sure.
Like, of course, I mean, insofar as someone's a Supreme Court justice and like accepts the legal system as it currently is, you got problems. But Sotomayor is probably the least morally shitty of them, though we haven't actually seen what Ketanji Brown Jackson can do.
I mean, I think she's not going to be. I mean, Breyer was, yeah. I think she's going to be more on the like, all right, she's okay side of things, but it doesn't really change the balance of the court.
No. Yeah.
Her ability to do much more than to consent is kind of really all. Go on.
Yeah. What you're gonna get is the best case is those Sotomayor 8-1s become 7-2s.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you got Elena Kagan, who is very much like a textualist, which is another word for originalist. She's just like not insane about it. You've got Neil Gorsuch, who's an originalist, who's insane about basically everything except Native American rights, where he suddenly realizes that the government is historically oppressive and goes after people who are in desperate need of legal defense. Like I said, Gorsuch knows no facts about history except for an incredibly deep knowledge of tribal law, and like
it
can
is pretty
list
bizarre
from his memory. Yeah, it makes him honestly the most for me the most frustrating person on the Supreme Court. It's like he knows better. He knows exactly how shitty the government is, and won't do anything about it except for white people and Native Americans. And then yeah, we all know the things about Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Barrett.
Yeah, cover those. So another thing that's coming down the pipeline. Yeah, the case that the Supreme Court is taking on subject of voting rights.
I really should know. It's dealing with the independent state legislature theory, and I know it's coming out of North Carolina. The name's Moore versus Harper.
Yes.
It's this is probably just like my little bit of belief in the system holding out, but I have to believe that the reason the Supreme Court is taking on this independent state legislature theory is to absolutely fucking dunk on it. Now, will that dunk be 9-0?
No, I think it's going to be more of like a 5-4.
It seems like they've certainly got votes for it. They've Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch. They might have Kavanaugh, though Kavanaugh has shown sensitivity towards not destroying the nation. But just to worth catching people up on the legal theory of the state legislature, because the state legislature is so batshit crazy, it's hard to understand how somebody could possibly come to believe this. And notably, I think few people come to believe this. Are you familiar with the reasoning behind this?
Not particularly.
So here's the basic thought: is you go in the Constitution. The Constitution says that legislatures run elections, right? So here's the relevant clause: the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations. Here's the natural way to read that. You've got this body, the state legislature. The state legislature gets to make rules. But obviously the state legislature is the body that's composed of like your state representatives that you vote on, and thus they have to follow the state constitution. Right, like very, very normal stuff, right? So like state constitutions sometimes say legislation can be blocked by a governor's veto or a citizen's referendum. Sometimes they say that like laws have to follow certain rules, right? So the 14th Amendment has some due process and equal rights stuff, but many states go beyond federal law in this way.
Of course.
That's like the natural way to read this, right?
Yeah.
Here's the way that independent state legislature people read it. The state legislature that's mentioned in the election clause, the one that prescribes the times, manner, and place of elections, isn't actually the state legislature you're familiar with. It's made up of exactly the same people, of course, but it's a completely different body. So it doesn't have to follow the state constitution. It doesn't have to listen to the governor. It can just pass any laws it wants. This idea initially sort of comes from Bush v. Gore, but Bush v. Gore doesn't really lay this thing out. Arizona tried to pass it in 2015 when the state legislature basically said, yeah, we know the citizens have constitutionally passed a thing for independent redistricting. We're just going to ignore that. The Supreme Court said that's bullshit. After 2020, Trump in his lawsuits tried to say that the state legislatures could just completely ignore election results and put forth whatever electors they want with whatever rules they wanted. Again, the Supreme Court said this is bullshit, but 6-3. Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch stood on board of it. So now the state legislature, the theory's coming again, and there's some thought because the Supreme Court has shown absolutely no interest in following the text of laws or the traditional interpretation of laws or the common sense reading of laws, that they might actually do this. But when you lay it out the way I did, which that's a neutral way to lay it out, really.
Yeah.
It's just an absolutely insane theory. And
right, because,
again, like,
yeah, I mean, you're pretending that that during the election cycle, the state legislature is no longer the state legislature; it's the state legislature, but different. Yeah, that's crazy talk, obviously, because there's no like independent election held for this second state legislature that only operates during the elections, thing like that. They're not different. They're not voted on in a different way or anything like that. It's the same body of people being treated differently in this particular circumstance for no real reason.
And for like 200 years, no one had any problem understanding what the Constitution meant. And just in case people don't know, like, the federal government does not protect a lot of what you think are pretty basic voting rights, right? So like in many states, for instance, you've got a right to a secret ballot. The government can't just reveal who people voted for, and they can't get a list of who voted for Joe Biden, who voted for Donald Trump, all of that. That's entirely in a state constitution.
Yeah.
Right. So if they wanted, and I'm sure no state legislature would ever consider doing such a thing, they could just release a list of all the Biden voters and just say, yeah, we've got unlimited power. We can just release the Biden voters to the public and say, hey, everybody, look, here's the list, names, address, phone number of every single Joe Biden voter. Don't do anything bad with that, guys.
Yeah.
No, really, don't hurt them.
This isn't a hit list. This is just a a public notice that nobody should concern themselves.
Yeah, they can say they're going to do this ahead of time, right? It's like, if you vote for Joe Biden, we will release your name. Don't worry about it. People tend to think that like you should have election commissions that review the results of elections who are like nonpartisan. Under this theory, state legislatures would get to decide whether an election was stolen or not. And again, I'm sure it would never happen that you convince state legislators to pretend an election is stolen because the candidate they want to win lost. We've never seen anybody attempt to do that before. But in theory, that could happen.
In theory, and then I think also like another big in theory sort of thing is the idea that there is such a thing as independent review.
Oh, no doubt. I agree that the review is not independent, but if you've got two choices, you can have people who are like nominally independent and don't have any political incentive to lie.
Yeah.
Or like the closest Trump allies who have worked with Donald Trump on his campaign for months, or Joe Biden, but only one presidential candidate has ever tried to do something like this. So I'm just going to use Trump as the example. Like, have worked with Donald Trump for months, want him to win, have been promised more political power if Trump wins. Like, if you have to take between those two groups to pick, even though the first group isn't like independent, right? They're not totally neutral. They've got their own biases and incentives they're bringing in. I'd much rather have those people be looking.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Better than the alternative. Seem to be alternative. Incredibly biased people who've been given shady incentives to lie or cheat or.
Did you see this guy in New Mexico?
No, I don't think I did.
So there's a county in southeastern New Mexico that had a primary, and the Republican county commission just refused to report the results of the election because they used Dominion voting machines. And the guy had a deep down feeling that Dominion voting machines were rigged. So like the state courts asked him for evidence. And he explicitly said, I have no evidence whatsoever, but I really feel like they're bad. So I'm just not going to count it. The state courts end up saying, F you got to count it. You can't just decide not to count votes.
Yeah.
But again, with independent state legislator theory, courts don't get to do anything.
Right.
Because
yeah.
courts can only interpret things in the context of existing laws and state constitutions. That's really where this came from, is North Carolina proposed an extraordinarily gerrymandered map, like much worse than what you normally see. And the state constitution says you can't do that. The legislators are saying, no, 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 no. We have unlimited power. And this is clearly what the Constitution intended.
The Constitution clearly intended that we draw the map so that nobody's democratic vote actually matters. Rig the election.
This is what reveals how unbelievably bankrupt originalism is, right? Because in theory, like, anybody who's a serious originalist should immediately see through this. If you're applying like a history and traditions test, or you're looking at the original meaning of the words, or you're looking at the meaning of the words as they mean today, nobody who can speak the English language, like competently, fluently, knows what the words mean from a dictionary, could possibly think this is what's going on. But you'll find that originalism is conveniently forgotten immediately once it stops being helpful to the Republican Party. Like, you look at what the Supreme Court did with Native American rights this term. It's extremely clear what the treaty said. And for more or less, we've been able to get along understanding what the words of those treaties mean, violating them, going against them, whatever. But like, it's very clear the kind of sovereignty Congress intended in the 1830s for Native American tribes to have. They just say it. They say the words. But once that original meaning becomes inconvenient for Republicans, suddenly original meaning is thrown out the window and we invent new stuff.
Well, I mean, that's where you like you take the original words, right? Find some cockamamie, completely outside of like reality way to explain, like, well, what they actually meant when they said sovereignty. If you look at this obscure writing from Adam Smith back in 1705 or whatever, it's clear that he didn't feel this way at the time, and so what he was doing was he was saying sovereignty, but with a little bit of a wink and a nod towards this other thing, which isn't actually sovereignty. And so, like, the originalists love digging really deep into like obscure nonsense to justify how this treaty or this constitutional actually means exactly what the Second Amendment, for instance, being about a well-regulated, and what did they really mean by regulate? Kind of what the original. So yeah, it's a incredibly disingenuous thing that. Go on, I think.
Well, you're speaking of guns. The most recent Supreme Court ruling on guns in New York, like the New York Rifle Association, sued the state for having concealed carry laws, and sometimes saying some people can't carry guns around concealed.
Like, if you have a history of being a bad person, maybe you should conceal.
Yeah, so here was what the law said. Is the law said you've got to have some reason to want to carry around a gun other than just like very neutral, I want to protect myself and my property. You've got to give some reason. And they're pretty loose on what a reason can be, right? You might be wealthy, you might be like have some reason to be afraid of your life, you might be a political, like, you just got to give some positive reason that's intelligible to the state. And what the Supreme Court does is they go back and they see that in the 1200s, you see, there weren't gun control laws. And the closest thing, of course, there weren't gun control laws. So what were the dagger control laws? This is serious. Like, Alito talks about how a dagger is the closest analog for a gun. And he goes back and says, yeah, there weren't dagger control laws. There weren't laws saying you couldn't carry a dagger around wherever you went. So gun control, you can't have that either. And then you just read the dissent, right? And it's people just listing off law after law after law of dagger control.
Right.
I'm not kidding. They found dagger control
No.
laws.
I'm sure they did. And then like, the
It's nonsense.
even if there wasn't like dagger control law or something like that, and Alito want to further obscure the case, you could just go like, well, and again, these are people who have very similar opinions to your most uneducated racist uncle. Where you see all these Facebook posts and shit like that that are like, look, you can kill someone with a rock. Cain killed Abel with a rock, and what were the rock control laws like American history? You can obscure it in as many disingenuous, and it's just it's in service of it's in service of gun manufacturing.
I mean, this is why you've got to be so scared of a history and traditions test being something the Supreme Court wants to apply everywhere. Because it's just like, the fact is, you can look for some analog to an AR-15, right? You can try and find something that was kind of like it, like a rock or a small dagger or a big sword or whatever. But the fact is there was just nothing technologically like this for most of the history of the United States, where anyone with a few $1,000s could go out and buy a semi-automatic rifle that you can use to kill a lot of people pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean it's got a fire rate faster than Gatling guns used in like of America.
Yeah, and what does an AR-15 weigh? Like 6.5, 7 pounds with a 20-round magazine?
It really kind of depends on how you like somewhere around there. Six
It
to eight
should, it's
pounds.
like the point is just like basically anyone could carry
Yeah.
this. You look at like Gatling guns. People like to talk about how there were rudimentary Gatling guns at the time the Constitution was ratified. Like, let's set aside all the issues of mechanical failure. You need 3 people to operate one of those
Right. Yeah.
things.
And that's kind of the point I was making is like you now
Yeah.
have in can be hidden in a bulky jacket weapon that does more work than what used to be a crew serve weapon. There should be some reasonable way to I think it's crazy that people leave something like that around them all the time.
It just can't be mentally healthy for you to have
No,
something like that and be thinking of like all the ways you can kill people who might try and hurt you.
yeah, it's a really bizarre think. It's a mental ill country. I mean, like I was in the military for 5 years. I went to Afghanistan twice, and I had to carry a rifle at all times and you know when I finally got back to the States and I was able to get rid of that fucking thing, I was so happy because it's such a burden to always have that thing on you and like always have to be aware that you might accidentally like pull the trigger if you're not like being careful about how you load, making sure you're in the right condition when you're carrying it around so that it accidentally shit. And I think of somebody who in America wants to like carry this thing around with, and bizarrely enough, I don't think there's any like condition laws in states. So, whereas on a military base in Afghanistan, active war zone, I have to make sure that I don't have a round in the chamber at all, accidentally discharge my weapon. Um, I don't think that exists back here in the States. And so it just anyone and everyone could be walking around with a round in their chamber, the safety off if they paying attention to it, or like the safety map. And then yeah, it's and the idea that we shouldn't have some kind of rational restriction. I mean, even if the gun control comes down to like if we catch you walking around in status where you have a round ready in your chamber and your safety's off, take your gun away for a while or something like that. Yeah, I mean,
Well, And this is, you talked about this at the beginning, but this is where it becomes clear that Congress is just as much of a problem here, because even if you take like the most radical Scalia interpretation on gun rights in the United States, you can still regulate the militia. And the
Right.
militia is like every able-bodied person, because Congress has to decide what the militia is, right? And something like you can't carry around a loaded weapon, or you've got to do training a certain amount of time every year. You got to spend a week. Like those are legitimate militia regulations that are well founded in the history and tradition, like all of that stuff. And Congress doesn't even try.
No.
Instead, you just get like the most recent gun control law we've seen, which does basically nothing. And still, Republicans are just having a fucking fit about it, because of course they are, right?
Republicans are having a fit about it, even though it does nothing. And then Democrats are singing "God Bless America" on the steps. On the steps of the Capitol.
It was, the day was bad, don't get me wrong, but you just can't help but laugh at how unbelievably tone deaf it is to, like, when we're rolling out a law that, rightly or wrongly, I think rightly, but regardless, many people think is like an imposition of theological values on most Americans. The song you pick is "God Bless America."
Yeah.
Really?
Amazing, right?
That's the best we've got. It's the only interesting thing in the Senate bill is red flag laws, and that's probably going to go.
Yeah,
the red flag, it doesn't even expand red flags. It just tells states we'll give you some money if you do.
Yeah. I mean, there's no, it's going to go nowhere. It's going to, this is exactly the issue that we have here. The legislature has technically, according to how the government is supposed to operate, way more power than the court. But legislature is so frozen and so incapable. And it's, largely because legislative branch has agreed to these rules make any sense, filibuster, that they can't get anything done. Well, we can't get anything done. And then, the court ends up ruling the nitty gritty details of the law that actually, because they're working with court case, not an kind of legislative backing that's given to say, hey, look, Clarence Thomas might disagree with, but we're the legislative branch. We're the writers of the law. The only thing the court is supposed to do is interpret that. But if you don't give them anything to interpret, they just make whatever ruling. I think this is maybe a good place to start winding down. Got anything else you want?
I got one more thing that
Yeah.
many people don't talk about that helps shape why courts act the way they do. So naturally, I mean, many people don't quite put this together, but like for the courts to rule on a case, the case has to be brought up. For a case to be brought up, in most relevant cases, you need the government on one side and some human being on the other. One thing that really helps stop things from coming together and stops actual cases from getting tested and stops rights from being exercised is the fact that prosecutors in the United States have absolute immunity. People freak out rightly about the fact that cops have qualified immunity, but for prosecutors, it's even worse. They have absolute immunity. They can't be sued for anything. This comes from a case, Imbor v. Pochtman, 1976. There's this guy, he was a defendant in a murder trial. He was convicted and sentenced. It turns out there was evidence the state attorney's office had the whole time that showed that he was innocent. He used that evidence to get himself exonerated. Great. Then he sued the prosecutor for withholding evidence. Like, this is against the law. As a prosecutor, you can't withhold evidence that's exculpatory towards defendants.
Is you're supposed to share any evidence you collect.
Yeah, and this is obviously extremely important, right? Like you just can't do without something like that, or else prosecutors will feel free to do whatever they want. Supreme Court rules that you can't sue the prosecutor for doing this because prosecutors might start second guessing themselves
Oh
or be
no.
nervous or afraid to do their job if they were liable for anything they did. So prosecutors aren't responsible for any injuries that result from their conduct on the job. So prosecutors can choose to sue they can choose to raise charges against anyone they want with no consequence. They can choose to not raise them against anyone they want with no consequences. They can share, withhold evidence. The only consequence they might face is getting fired. But there's no criminal or civil liability if you're a prosecutor. And these people are they're career minded, right? Like basically anyone in the so-called justice system, like they want to move up and get the big convictions. And it's very hard and a rare case to prove that there's exculpatory evidence that was hidden. Like the problems go all the way down at every level. And the
Yeah,
fact that
and
constitutional amendments are basically impossible to pass makes this really hard to deal with.
yeah, and it should be noted that our current vice president has a long history of hiding evidence and distorting facts, and keep people in prison or guilty. So this.
Yeah, I mean, Kamala Harris bragged about smoking marijuana at the same time that she was one of the hardest prosecutors on drugs in the United
Oh yeah,
States.
absolutely. And then there's other cases of her hiding evidence that would have probably exonerated a murder trial defendant. So these things go down to the very roots, and then find these people at the very top. Vice president doesn't really do a whole lot.
Well, we just live in a society that's deeply committed to tough on crime. Like, I don't know how much you followed Ketanji Brown Jackson's confirmation hearing, but one significant thing that a lot of Republicans went after her for was that she was a federal defender, public defender for a year and a half.
Yeah, and how
So
dare
people were
you
accusing her.
be how dare you be on the other side of the equation here, standing up for people's rights rather than trying to punish them for something.
Yeah, people asked whether her heart was with the criminal, whether she was committed to defending child rape, whether she supported child rapists. And it's like, I mean, we're seeing a surge now from media and tough on crime coverage, right? I was reading a thing from a San Francisco newspaper recently that talked about how even though violent crime is way down, violent crime is probably actually up a lot because people are just so convinced that the police won't do anything that they never report their violent crimes anymore, which is bullshit.
It's
Everyone knows it's bullshit. You've got the mayor of Chicago, former prosecutor, surprisingly, saying that in Chicago, presumption of innocence doesn't really apply because the cops only raise charges against people they're really confident are guilty.
Yeah.
So you just shouldn't have bail for anyone accused of a violent crime. Like, it's all of these things work together, right? And it's really easy to say, look, the Supreme Court's bad because the Supreme Court is bad, right? They're consistently deeply shitty, but it's very easy to be pessimistic on the possibility of reform when you see that every aspect of the US justice system and the media coverage and the people around it and people at large are just totally fine with huge numbers of innocent people going to prison for bullshit. Because we got to be tough on crime, even though anyone who's ever studied it knows it doesn't work.
I have a coworker who both of her parents work in law enforcement, and this was right after the Uvalde stuff happened, where you have a clear indication that the cops just do not give a shit about doing anything to protect people, lie a bunch, probably have a lot of issues with leadership, et cetera. Really clear case where nobody can actually defend the cops in this circumstance. And even immediately right after that, one of my other coworkers called up for jury duty, and oh yeah, I always get out of jury duty because I just say both of my parents are in law enforcement, and if somebody's here in court, they're guilty. It doesn't matter. So even with all these clear indications of how bad the police, really this national conversation. Wow, maybe the cops don't fucking care about us. This person was still just willing to be like, no, if somebody's brought to court by the police, they did something wrong, even if it wasn't
Wait,
the crime that. Go ahead.
Did they say that strategically? Like, I just want to get out of jury duty, or did they believe
No.
it?
She was saying it genuinely. She was like, "No, I've heard stories
Oh,
from my parents
fuck.
that like anyone who's brought in front of court is basically guilty of something, even if it's not the thing that they've been brought up for." And I think this is a genuine belief of a lot of people, which maybe we could talk another time about how the justice system kind of is rigged for shitty results, regardless of of who's kind of in charge of the system. Um, the idea that you get seen by a jury of your peers and not a highly selected individual to don't have any radical beliefs and maybe aren't that invested in any kind of like greater understanding of how justice works. You get a jury of people who agree to certain things that the court won't throw out,
Just the
etc.
fact that whether the judge is having a good day or a bad day, your preliminary hearing has huge impacts on what sorts of things will be allowed to be used against you. Yeah,
Right.
that's another topic.
For sure.
But it's good to keep in mind, like, the Supreme Court is incredibly powerful. You've got 9 people up there. They make these huge consequential rulings, but the most consequential things, like Dobbs v. Jackson's terrible, right? But the Supreme Court's going to see maybe 1 or 2 criminal abortion cases over the next 5 years. Where it's really going to have its impact, and where the problems of the justice system are going to be felt the most, is the fact that prosecutors are going to use their immunity to go after just some random person that had a miscarriage, or a person who got an abortion for all kinds of reasons. You're going to have some stick in the mud Republican judge who doesn't give a shit about anything except his own career. And you're going to have a jury that thinks, oh yeah, if the police charge them with a crime, they've got to be guilty, so we'll just convict.
Yep.
Like, that is where huge numbers of problems come from. And if we had a really good justice system with like Sam Alito at the head of it, and they just resisted all the shitty stuff he did, it would be bad, but it wouldn't be so bad.
Yeah. Well,
How
that's as a cheery a note I think we can end. Nobody listens to this podcast to walk away feeling full of hope or anything. And if you do, I'm sorry. Gonna be
Wait, here's the real sad thing is, like, even if miraculously, and of course I don't want this to happen, and I oppose all political violence in all forms, and I stand strongly against the actions of Antifa and any other sort of organization that might engage in such tomfoolery. But if horrifically a Supreme Court justice were to be killed, national tragedy, thoughts and prayers. Like when someone on the Supreme Court, right, like Alito or Kavanaugh or whatever, it wouldn't change a damn thing, because you've got
really
so many callous people so far on. Even if it somehow changed the balance of the Supreme Court, the callousness is all the way down. That's the happy outcome, is you got to kill a lot of people to make this work.
Worth noting, and I brought it up on regular episode, but Joe Biden, who does a good enough move nominating Ketanji Brown Jackson, also strikes a deal with Mitch McConnell to appoint a federal judge that's anti-abortion, kind of a far right wing. In return for, what was it? It was
McConnell not filibustering 2 temporary prosecutor nominations in Kentucky.
Right. Yeah. Which, again, we've already highlighted why prosecutors also kind of suck and how they have a dangerous. So no real win by any means. The federal judge seat is lifetime. The 2 temporary prosecutor seats are obviously temporary, and prosecutors don't necessarily
you're telling me Joe Biden did that?
Joe Biden, Joseph
Robinette Biden Jr. said shortly after the overturning of Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, that he would do everything in his power to protect a woman's right to abortion.
Everything in his power.
He said he would do everything. You're telling me he didn't do the most?
The most basic.
If this doesn't lend credence to Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. Vatican plant, Like that's the theory, right? Have
Yeah.
you seen that meme where Joe Biden's like lifting a weight, he's on the phone with a pope, and he's like, "I've overturned abortion. We're going for gay marriage next."
Yeah, yeah,
They
yeah.
think I'm senile. Like that's.
Yeah.
I almost hope that's true, just
There's
so
also
that
the
we have
meme of
someone
like the
competent to
last like
charge.
5 presidents, right? And
Yeah, Protestant,
Yeah, all these Protestants that
Catholic.
couldn't get abortion overturned, and then Joe Biden, it only takes him 2 years to get rid of abortion as a Catholic. Funny, but also sad. Sad, and we feel
Yeah,
bad.
I'm just saying, I hope the Biden Catholic plant theory is true, just because it means you've got someone who knows what they're doing in charge instead of someone who is inarguably suffering from the effects of mental decay.
I mean, that's probably a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, we can end here. We can end
Yeah,
here.
let's
You
just
tried
end
to
here.
end it. I said F you. Now
No,
we'll
no,
end
that's
it.
fine. People say that to me all. All right, well, Robert, thank you very much for your time and your insight on the matter. We'll have to do it again sometime. I enjoyed this.
Yeah, it's always fun to talk about courts.
Yeah.
Everybody loves. It's like everybody loves Raymond. You know how everybody actually hates Raymond on Everybody Loves Raymond?
Right.
It's,
Everybody
that's what it's
loves
like.
talking about the courts, as rule I've always stood by. All right, well, thank you very much. Have a good. I'm sure you're going to be doing lots of celebrating on the 4th of July because you're clear a good patriot who loves his country.
You know, the one thing the Supreme Court hasn't done is they have not overturned Texas v. Johnson. So you still have a right to burn an American flag.
Doesn't matter what day of the year it is, baby.
Yeah, but today you gotta admit today's a pretty decent day. Like as things go, you can make all the old people like watching fireworks or whatever. You're like,
Yeah.
watch this. You pour some lighter fluid over a flag. Boom, beautiful flames.
Yep. They can't technically do anything to you. All right, sir. Have a good one. Bye. Hi. You just watched a video from the Benzo Rehab Dungeon. You either did or did not enjoy the content. That's more on you than it is me. I just make the content. If you enjoyed this, please go to patreon.com/Benzo Rehab Dungeon. You can give as little or as much as you like. We don't discriminate by wealth. We consider ourselves a public access rehabilitation program. As always, we love you very much. Please take your medicine.